As many of you will know, when Texas joined the United States, it looked like this. However, a mere 5 years later, it had lost all of these lands, which nowadays form parts of New Mexico, Oklahoma, Kansas, Colorado, and even Wyoming. This massive loss of land raises an obvious question: why? Why did Texas lose all this territory, and why did the Texans agree to it? So in 1836, Texas won its independence from Mexico after a short war. Mexico didn't really accept this independence, but there was little they could do about returning Texas to the fold given all of the unofficial help that the United States had given it during the war. The brand new Republic of Texas claimed all of this territory, but only really had firm control over this. That doesn't mean Mexico controlled it. In fact, most of it was controlled by the Comanche tribe, but nobody recognized their claim to anything. So after about a decade of politically ignoring Texas, the US annexed it as a state. The overlapping claims of the US's newest member in Mexico soon led to the Mexican-American War, which ended with a US victory and Mexico losing all of this. So after winning a war for Texas's disputed territory, it would be fair to assume that Texas would be given its claimed lands, but fun fact, no. Instead, the federal government argued that the Texan claim wasn't that strong, and that even though the land definitely wasn't Mexican anymore, it also wasn't Texan. The concern was that this new state was far too large and thus would wield too much power in the future. And so, as part of a broader discussion on how to incorporate America's new land, several prominent senators put forward proposals on how to divide Texas. The first idea was that of Missouri Senator Thomas Benton, who proposed that Texas be divided like this, with the north and west going to the federal government as part of the territory of New Mexico, and the rest being divided into two states, Texas and Colorado. This plan was much more about keeping the free state-slave state balance in the Union, but it was also unpopular with the Texans. Furthermore, it broke the rule of splitting states. The next plan was put forward by Senator Henry Foote, who pushed for Texas to simply be divided into two states, Texas and the brand new state of Jacinto. This went nowhere because, again, no splitting states. And if the Texans didn't like those plans, they really weren't going to like that of Senator John Bell. This would see this territory handed to New Mexico and Texas divided into two new states. The land east of the Trinity River would be the state of Texas, and the rest of the land would become the Colorado Territory. That was until its population got large enough that it could be split into two new states, which Bell wanted to call Colorado and Washington. This proposal wasn't even considered by the Texans. Thus, the US government needed to make sure that Texas kept much more of its territory, and two ideas were put forward. The first was by Henry Clay, who just did this, giving this land to New Mexico. This was rejected because it meant that this tiny piece of land here would be ceded from New Mexico to Texas, which meant opening a whole new can of worms. And thus, no. In the end, it was Senator James Pierce that settled the issue. He put forward this border which took this from Texas and gave it to the federal government. This was acceptable to Congress because it didn't require splitting the state of Texas, so long as you considered this to be Texas and this to be extra territory that just happened to belong to Texas. So why did the Texans agree to this when initially they just wanted to keep all of their land? Well, the answer was money. Texas has racked up a lot of debt from its independence war, and the federal government promised to take on that debt in return for Texas being carved up. Another reason was that whilst Texas did claim all of this, it never really held on to it, and so what it was given was still seen as extra and still made Texas the largest state in the Union. As such, both sides were mostly happy, and Texas took on the shape that it has to this day. I hope you enjoyed this episode, with a special thanks to my patrons James Bisonet, Kelly Moneymaker, Korsho Wolf, Kartoitska, Alex Schwinn, Andy McGehey, Jerry Lambdin, Rod D. Martin, AF Firefly, Marcus Arsner, Wyan Hockey, Spencer Lightfoot, Marvin Kassow, Captain Sidog, Kamoon Yoon, Winston Kaywood, Miss Izette, Boogly Woogly, Maggie Paxkowski, The McWhopper, Gustav Swan, Calling Dr. Howard, Dr. Fine, Dr. Howard, Copper Tone, Shuenin, Spinning Three Plates, Words About Books Podcast, Jim Stroomberg, Words About Books Podcast, and Charles the First.